The Egyptian-Israeli border today is no longer a front line. The state of war between the two countries, which had existed since 1948, was formally ended with the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in March 1979. The quiet border is a sign of a stagnant peace. It was not supposed to be this way. In their peace treaty, Egypt and Israel agreed to establish diplomatic, economic and cultural relations, including an end to economic boycotts. This process is commonly summed up in one word: normalization. But the process came to a halt following Sadat's assassination.
Normalization has become a dirty word in Arab political vocabulary. This disappointed the Israelis. What the Israelis really wanted is a people-to-people peace. Israel gave up, returned a vast territory, oil fields, strategic assets, a town, villages, airfields. And what did it get in return? In return, it got peace, which is essentially, it's a piece of paper. It's something that the Egyptians signed. It's not as concrete as the Israeli concessions.
To this day, many Egyptians reject normalization, angered by what they see as Israel's denial of Palestinian rights, its continuing settlement activity in occupied Arab territories, and its military offensives.
You know that there is no love lost between the Egyptian people and the Israelis. You know that the Israelis feel isolated in this part of the world. Very few people are willing to engage them in serious contacts. The Israeli ambassadors that come here don't stay very long because they feel ostracized, they feel isolated. I mean, the first ambassador, I think, started by walking in the street thinking that people would be very happy to see him.
It did not take long for reality to sink in. Israeli diplomats soon became a high-status target. During the mid-80s, a group calling itself Thawrat Masr, or Revolution of Egypt, carried out a number of assassinations of Israeli diplomats in Cairo. Members of the group were arrested at the end of 1987. The group's leader was a former Egyptian intelligence officer who had resigned following Sadat's visit to Jerusalem 10 years earlier. Another member of the group was the son of former Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser. Israel's embassy in Cairo was the subject of a satirical movie. In 2005, an Egyptian film called El Sefara fi El Omara, or the Embassy in the Building, dealt with the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. Starring famous Egyptian actor Adel Imam, it tells the story of an expatriate who returns to Cairo after many years working in the Gulf, only to find a shock waiting for him. The Israeli embassy is in the same building in which he lives.
The film has a deeper message, which is that as long as Israel deals with the Arabs in the way it does, and especially with the Palestinians, then there is not the slightest chance of being good neighbors.
In the world of music, Egyptian singer Shaban Abdul Rahim had a smash hit with his song called I Hate Israel.
There are things in the Egyptian media which go beyond legitimate political criticism. When they denounce the Jewish people as a people or its religion as a religion, when they use anti-Semitic themes from the worst sources in the West, this goes beyond criticism, and this is very difficult for the Israelis to accept.
The peace treaty stipulated that Egypt and Israel should abstain from hostile propaganda against each other. Ali Abu Shadi is Egypt's top censor. While tightly controlling free speech in Egypt, the government censors see no problem in attacking Israel through the arts.
What's the problem? There are clauses in the treaty which the Israelis are violating. So let them object. So what? We can also object to many things. I have a right to express my point of view. There are international laws that forbid Israel from the policies it is continuing. So why are they judging me? When they abide by international laws, then so will I.
Egyptian unions and syndicates took strong action against any members who spoke in favor of normalization. When Egyptian author Ali Salem traveled to Israel in 1994 with the aim of writing a book, he drew a hostile response from his peers.
That's blackmail. And this blackmail reached its peak when I was fired from the Actors Syndicate in 1996. And later I was fired from the Writers' Union in 2001.
For their part, Israeli intellectuals and artists discovered that they were not welcome in Egypt.
Cairo holds a big annual book fair. And at first, 1980, I was present there. We did participate. We were given a special corner for the Israeli books, and we brought books here. And it worked. And next year, there were those who are adversaries in Cairo who hate us, arranged violent demonstrations against Israeli participation. And in the year after, the government said, we can't protect you.
As a professor of Arabic literature, Sasson Somekh was chosen to head the Israeli Academic Center in Cairo.
No university would invite me to give a lecture, and they know that I have written several things about Arabic literature, but nobody would invite me to give a lecture. Very few institutions would allow me to use their libraries.
From the Egyptian side, cases of exchange and cooperation with Israelis were viewed with great suspicion. Rumors even surrounded a joint agricultural project.
Public opinion was quite negative about this cooperation when certain diseases began to appear in our palm trees. People claim Israel was behind this. It was the same with bees and with some other crops. People started saying that Israeli seeds were causing damage to our soil, which would last for years.
In the 80s and 90s, Egyptian Minister of Agriculture Youssef Wali became a target of accusation and blame for the import of Israeli pesticides that many believed were a cause of cancer.
There are many accusations and much exaggeration about Israel, but no evidence. If we look at this from a social and political point of view, then all these rumors and this suspicion highlights a distrust towards Israel. People are very willing to believe that Israel is behind every calamity.
The level of mistrust was an indication of how strained the relationship had become in the eyes of ordinary Egyptians. After a decade of isolation, Egypt formally regained its membership in the Arab League when it was invited to attend the Casablanca summit in 1989. Arab leaders agreed to draw a distinction between President Hosni Mubarak and his predecessor Anwar Sadat, who had negotiated and signed the peace treaty with Israel. The following year, in 1990, the Arab League agreed to move its headquarters back to Cairo. The official view in Egypt was that its return to the Arab League vindicated its refusal to scrap the peace treaty. But the popular view was that Egypt had rejoined Arab ranks with its standing damaged.
Sadat had tried to take Egypt out of the Arab-Israeli conflict and to bring an end to Egypt's role as the leader of the Arab cause. He succeeded in both cases. Unfortunately, Egypt has not recovered this leading role, even to this day.
In 1993, PLO leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands before cheering crowds on the White House lawn in Washington. It was where Sadat and Begin had signed peace 14 years earlier. The handshake marked the signing of a declaration of principles for peace between the Palestinians and Israelis.
I think the Israelis realize that their presence in Egypt is not welcomed by the Egyptian people. They realize that if they want to be accepted, they have never been accepted. If they want to be accepted, they have to make peace with all the Arab countries and with the Palestinians. They realize it is important.
And what we are committed to is the end of the state of war.
In 1994, Jordan also signed a peace treaty with Israel. As Arab leaders made their peace with Israel, Egypt's role as an intermediary increased. Cairo and Sharm el-Sheikh became regular venues for Arab-Israeli talks and summits.
We in Egypt play this very carefully because you can use pressure to a certain degree, but you have to be very careful not to trespass on something that would be harmful to you and to the cause you are defending.
Egypt's role as a mediator was challenged when violence once again erupted in the region. Following the visit of Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon to the Jerusalem mosque complex in September 2000.
I came here with a message of peace. I believe that we can live together with the Palestinians.
Walking on one of the most contested religious sites in the world, Sharon's visit was the spark for the second Palestinian Intifada. In November, Egypt ordered the withdrawal of its ambassador to Israel, Mohammed Bassiouni, in protest of Israel's military actions against Palestinian demonstrators. Many Arabs felt Egypt's diplomatic gesture was too mild.
If withdrawing your ambassador or expelling the Israeli ambassador was going to achieve peace, then we would have done this a very long time ago. But this would mean breaking international agreements we have signed and the diplomatic ties we have established with the other country, including the exchange of ambassadors. We have to show the world that we are people who respect international agreements. Secondly, why must I speak to the Israelis through a third party in order to help the Palestinians? We are playing this card for the benefit of the Palestinians. When I throw away all my cards, pull out my eyes that see and my tongue that speaks for me in Israel, then I will need to have a third party to speak on my behalf. And this would be a loss for the Palestinian cause.
The renewed cycle of violence in the Middle East was a setback for Egypt's role as a peace broker between the Arabs and Israelis.
People oppose visits by some Israeli responsibles, but in fact, all this is not a love affair. It's perhaps a relationship of interest, where we want to get something, and if you want to get something from somebody, so sometimes you try to appear more accepting of him than you really are. But deep in the heart of Egyptians, they resent very much what the Israelis are doing.
Aware of this resentment, Mubarak had always been cautious when it came to the peace treaty his predecessor had signed with Israel.
At this important juncture in the history of the Middle East,
Mubarak avoided going to Israel, only visiting once to briefly attend the funeral of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. But some Egyptians still feel their president has played a weak hand with the Israelis.
He's responsible for continuing Sadat's policies and for upholding the peace treaty with Israel. 30 years after the signing of the treaty, he has not tried to adapt it or fit it to Egypt's interests.
Today, some Egyptians are calling for the peace treaty to be amended. In particular, the clauses relating to restrictions on the stationing of Egyptian armed forces in the Sinai.
What we recovered from Israel was incomplete. It is true that we took back the Sinai. We claim that it's back under Egyptian sovereignty. But I'm telling you that this is just rhetoric. In actual fact, we cannot deploy a single tank or send in any military force into the Sinai.
And each time violence flares in the Middle East, Egypt's peace with Israel is brought into the spotlight. During Israel's bombardment of Lebanon in 2006, many Egyptians questioned the peace treaty which took Egypt out of the region's military equation. And during Israel's war on Gaza in 2009, many Egyptians and Arabs suspected Egypt of being compliant to, or even complicit with, Israeli military plans.
Must need to understand that our aspiration to live in peace doesn't mean that Israel is going to take this kind of situation any longer. Enough is enough.
Once something happens, people say, let's cancel Camp David. But canceling Camp David means declaring war. And for whose sake would Egypt declare war? Let me tell you this. Some people in the Arab world might be ignorant, or may just watch war on TV for their amusement. And in the Arab world, you find those who say that Egypt should fight Israel to the last Egyptian soldier. But all that is now in the past. What's important now is the future of the Egyptian people.
But others in the Arab world feel that Egypt's treaty with Israel has diminished its traditional role at the vanguard of the Arab cause and has limited its options in the region.
When you say we will not fight again, you are encouraging the spirit of defeat and undermining the fighting spirit of the Egyptian army. Despite all that, I am not asking them to fight. There are other options between war, surrender, and silence.
The peace treaty between Egypt and Israel stipulated a normalization of relations in all fields. The relationship has proved difficult at times. The treaty was supposed to be the first step towards a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. But such hopes have proved elusive.
We are definitely heading towards a clash. It might happen in a couple of years or a couple of centuries, but I believe anything is possible. Every Arab country should identify its position. Does it stand with the resistance or with Israel?
I believe that peace between Egypt and Israel is solid, stable, because it is based on mutual interests. The two countries want to have a stable Middle East. Both Egypt and Israel struggle against terrorism, sometimes against the same terrorist organizations. The two countries in their foreign policy have a US orientation. So on the basis of this convergence of interests, I believe that in time relations will develop into something which is not a cold peace, but a real peace.
Boutros Ghali accompanied Sadat on his first visit to Israel in 1977. As former Egyptian foreign minister, and later as UN Secretary General, he was an eyewitness to the Arab-Israeli peace process. Cold peace is how he once described the relationship between Egypt and Israel, a description that is still valid to this day.
I mentioned it was a cold peace, I agree, but it was a cold peace as long as the Palestinian problem will not be solved. And it will continue to be a cold peace as long as the Palestinian problem will not be solved.